complicated.
Good morning out there, students. My name is Teacher Prashant, and please allow me to welcome you all to this video. Now, this video is linear graphs part 4, and in today's video we'll be learning what is a gradient in a graph. Now, before I start this lesson and tell you what is a gradient, please keep in mind that learning gradient is the backbone of learning linear graphs. So if you want to learn linear graphs properly, you have to understand the meaning of gradient. But don't worry, we'll be breaking down the meaning of this term gradient piece by piece, and you all can count in pieces. I don't care. So let's proceed into this lesson. So let's explore the term gradient or slope of a straight line in graphs. Now, what is a gradient and what is the gradient actually made up of? Gradient is simply change in the value of y divided by change in the value of x. Now, what is change in the value of y? If you want to find change in something, you have to have two of that something. So once we have two of that something, we can subtract them two and find out the change in the value of something. So if we have two values of y, we can find out the change in the values of y, and the same concept applies to x. If we have two values of x, we can find out the change in the values of x. Now, those numbers are very easy to find. If you subtract two values of y together, you get the change in value of y, and if you subtract two values of x together, you get the change in the value of x. Now, once we have both our values, which is change in y and change in x, we can actually divide them together and find out our gradient. And I think we have a problem right here. And our problem is, where do we find those two values of x and y from? And the solution to our problem is, we get those two values of x and y from two different set of coordinates. So let me write xy and xy. Now, where do we find these two coordinates? Now, we can find these two coordinates on any graph. So as we can see on the right hand side, we have a graph and we have two coordinates on the graph. And that's all we need to find out the value for our gradient. Why? Because we need two values of x and two values of y, and these two coordinates will give us two values of x and two values of y. How? Let's see. So at R, we will have one value of x and one value of y. And at coordinate P, we will have one value of x and one value of y, which will give out two values of x and two values of y, and we can find out the difference and divide them and find out what is the gradient. So just now we learned how to find out a gradient. So the formula to find out the gradient is change in y divided by change in x. But does that actually tell us what is a gradient? No, that just tells us how to find our gradient. Now let's get to the core and find out what is the real meaning of a gradient. Now, the real meaning of a gradient is steepness of a slope. Now, steepness is a part of slope, and slope itself is a bigger story. Now let's go learn what is a steepness of a slope. Alright, so let's get into the core of this lesson and study the steepness of a slope, which is actually the gradient of a line. Now, how the steepness of a slope is actually the gradient of a line, we are going to find out in this lesson very soon. Let's start with what is the slope. Slope is any surface where one end is at higher level than another end. So as we can see in this shape, we have two ends, point A and point B. And point B is placed at a higher level compared to point A. So if we join these 2 points with the help of a straight line, this straight line will be the slope of point A and point B. And why? Because point B is placed at a higher level and point A is placed at a lower level. So if you join these 2 points with the help of a straight line, you will get a slope of these 2 points, and that's what a slope is. Keep in mind that this slope is facing downwards to the right direction. And the same concept applies to shape 2 and shape 3, where 2 points A and B are connected with the help of a straight line, which gives out the slope of those 2 points, which is slope B in shape 2 and slope C in shape number 3. So shape 1, shape 2 and shape 3, all these 3 shapes have 2 points, point A and point B. And in every shape, those 2 points are connected with the help of a straight line, which means every shape has a slope line of its own. So in shape number 1 we have slope A, in shape number 2 we have slope B, and in shape number 3 we have slope C. Now I have a question to everyone who is watching this video, and my question to everyone is slope A, B and C. So we have 3 slopes. Are they different in any terms? And if they are different, how and why they are different? Now, what is that criteria which could classify all these 3 slope lines as different? Now, this is the point where steepness kicks in. What is steepness? Steepness is basically how rapid and intensive the decline of the slope is depending upon the relationship between its dimension, which is length and height of 2 points. Let's have a look at slope A. So how intensive and rapid the decline of the slope is. And decline of the slope is not that bad because of its two dimension, which is height and length. Height is relatively low compared to the length of the shape, which gives out a low steep, which means the decline is not that rapid or intense, and we can term it as low steep. Now let's move on to shape number 2. If we have a look at the slope line in shape number 2, the decline is rapid and intense, but it is not like super intense. It is declining at a decent rate. So we could term this as medium steep, which means the steep is not very rapid, it is not very intense. It is a kind of decent and medium steep. Now let's move on to shape number 3. In shape number 3, we can see that the height is relatively high compared to its length. So if the height is more than the length, we all know that that slope is going to be intense and it will be declining rapidly, because with the same amount of length, a little bit of extra height is added into the shape when it declines very rapidly, because it has to cover the same amount of distance while it declines with the increased amount of height. That's why the slope has to decline rapidly in order to meet point A. So we can term this steep as high steep, because there's a little bit of extra height added to the steep. Now, how rapid and intense the steep is also depend on the angle between the slope and the line. So the smaller the angle is, the less complex the steep will be. And the larger the angle is, the more intensive the steep will be. So this is actually the second criteria on which you can define that all these three slopes are not same. Now, how is this information related to our topic gradient of line? Now, this is actually what a gradient of line is. If you could represent low steep, medium steep, high steep in terms of numerical values, that's what a gradient is. So how do we represent all these different kind of steep in form of numerical values or in form of numbers? Alright, so let's go represent the steepness of the slope in numerical values to find out the gradient of the graph. Now we are going to be applying whatever we have learned so far into this video to find out the gradient of point A and point B, or any point on any straight line in any quadrant of the graph. We need to find out the slope, and we need to find out how steep that slope is, which will give out the value of our gradient. Since we know that gradient equals change in y divided by change in x, so we need two values of y and two values of x, and at this both coordinates we have a value of x and y, which concludes as two values of x and two values of y. So let me write this as y2, and let me write this as y1. This is x2 and this is x1. So let's have a look at change in y. So at first y was 4, and then y came back to 0 at the second point. So at point A the value of y is 4, and at point B the value of y is 0. It means y has declined 4 units. So the change in y will be 4. Delta y equal 4 units, because y just dropped down to 0 from 4. Now what about x? X also dropped down from 2 to 0. At coordinate A the value of x was 2, and at coordinate B x is 0, which means the change in x is from 2 to 0, which gives out change in x equal 2. So delta x equal 2. So gradient is change in y divided by change in x, which will be 4 divided by 2 equal 2. Now we know that this slope will be intense because the height of these 2 points and this length of 2 points are not equal. We can see that height is relatively more than the length of these 2 points. So that's why we have a slope of 2. Now what does this gradient mean? This means if x changes by 1, y will change by 2, which means we will have a coordinate 1 and 2. Now if this coordinates comes on this line, it means our gradient is right. So x is 1, which is right here, and y is 2. So this will be the coordinate where x will be 1 and y will be 2, and it is on the same line. So keep in mind that gradient of any 2 point on a straight line will be same. It doesn't matter whatever points you pick up. Now the reason why gradient of any 2 point on this line will be equal, because this line has a hidden equation behind it. That's where this line came from. Y equals 2x means y equal 2 times x. Means whatever the value of x is, y will be twice the value of x. So let's have a look at this point. Point A, x is 2 and y is actually twice of 2, which is 2 times 2 equals 4. At point number C, x is 1 and y is 2, which means y is twice the value of 1. Why? Because 1 times 2 equals 2. And at this point y is 0. So if you put 2 times 0, it will be 0, which will give out the value of y and x both equal to 0. But this is not the topic for this class. This is actually coming up in future. We need to build our foundation and learn every basics before we advance ourselves further into the linear graphs. And in future we will be learning why linear graphs have a straight line. Now let me tell you a little bit why they have a straight line, because every coordinate is derived from the same proportion, which is the equation of the line, y equals 2x. So every point will represent the proportion of this equation. That's why the gradient of every point on this line is equal. And all of this content we'll be learning soon in our future videos. So stay tuned. We're going to be learning right thing at the right time. So on this side, the gradient is 1. If the steep is intense, the gradient will be high, and the less complex the slope is, will give out to you less complex value as a gradient. So if the steep is intense, it will give you more of a value for a gradient, but if the steep is not as intense, it will give you the lesser of a value for your gradient. So as we all know, what is the formula of a gradient of a line, which is y2 minus y1 divided by x2 minus x1. Now what is this y2 and y1? y2 and y1 are two different set of y values from two different set of coordinates, and x2 and x1 is two different set of x values from two different set of coordinates, which is basically change in y-axis divided by change in x-axis. In other words, difference between two values of y divided by difference between two values on x-axis. So let's go use this formula and find one more gradient. So we have to find out the gradient of this 2 point A and point B. As we can see on the graph, we have point A and point B. Now let's join these 2 points with the help of a straight line and find out the slope. Okay, so this is the slope. Now it looks like a little bit intense slope because the height is 2 times the length. If the length is 2, the height is 4. So since it looks kind of intense, the gradient might be high. So first of all, write x and y. So 1 is x and 5 is y in coordinate B. Minus 1 is x and 1 is y. Mark this as x1 and y1 and mark this as x2 and y2. Now since we know what is x1, y1 and what is x2 and y2, we could actually substitute the value in our formula. So y2 minus y1 equals 1 minus 5. And x2 minus x1 is minus 1 minus 1. 1 minus 5 is minus 4. And minus 1 is minus 2 equals. Now minus divided by minus is plus. And 4 divided by 2 is 2. So 2 is our gradient of this line. Now let us look at the same gradient on this graph really quick. So the change in y is 4 and change in x is 2. Why? Because at point A, y was 5 and at point B, y is 1. So y changed from 5 to 1, which totals the change of 4. So change in y equal 4 and change in x equal 2, because from 1 x went to 0 and from 0 x went to minus 1. So that's a change of 2 units. So the gradient is change in y divided by change in x. So 4 divided by 2, our gradient will be 2. So we have the same answer. You could do it on a graph or you could use a formula to do it, whatever you feel convenient with. Okay, so let us practice a little bit more. So find the answer for question number 1 and question number 2, which is find out the gradient of point A and B and also find out the gradient of point C and D. Now within 10 seconds from now, I'm going to show you the answers. So pause the video right now and try to find out the answer for question number 1 and 2 and then play the video back on to check your answers. So answer number 1 is 2 and answer number 2 is minus 2, which means we have a positive gradient and we have a negative gradient as well. Now what is a positive gradient and what is a negative gradient? So this is what it breaks down to. Listen very carefully. Now the gradient of 2 point on the line which is facing downwards to the right direction will have a negative gradient compared to the coordinate of 2 point of a line which is facing upward to the right direction. If you don't believe me, pick 2 random coordinates from both the graphs and find out. The gradient of left hand side graph will be negative and the gradient of right hand side graph will be positive. So we are about to finish this lesson And let's recap this lesson really quick. What did we learn in this lesson? We learned what is a gradient by doing a complete breakdown of the term gradient, and also understanding the core of the gradient and where the actual meaning of the gradient come from. So before I finish my video, let me tell you the topic for our next lesson. In our next lesson, we'll be learning x-intercept and y-intercept. So thank you so much for watching, and consider subscribing if you're interested in more future maths content, and please do hit a like on this video if this video was of any help to you. Thank you so much for watching. A very goodbye from Teacher Prashant, and I'll see you guys again in my next video.